Look at a map, and Iran sits right next to Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Same sun, same dust, same broad region that textbooks have lumped together for generations under one label, Middle Eastern. And for most of the 20th century, that label carried an unspoken assumption that the people living across this region came from more or less the same ancient pool. Close neighbors, shared ancestry, minor variations at most. That assumption is wrong. Not wrong by a small margin either. The genetic split between Iranians and their Arab neighbors doesn't trace back centuries. It doesn't even trace back a few thousand years. It traces back tens of thousands of years to a divergence so old that by the time the first farmers ever planted a seed in this region, these two populations had already been separated longer than the entire history of civilization. Scientists suspected the region was more complicated than the old model allowed. What they didn't expect was just how complicated, or how old the split actually was. And the answer, once it surfaced, didn't come from a history book. It came from the ground, out of a set of bones that had been waiting 10,000 years to say something nobody was prepared to hear. For most of the 20th century, population genetics in the Middle East ran on a simple model. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Levant through Mesopotamia and into the foothills of Iran, was understood as the birthplace of agriculture. One origin, one event, one population that learned to farm and then carried that knowledge outward in every direction. The logic felt obvious. These regions are geographically connected. The crops overlap. The archaeological timelines overlap. Why would anyone assume that two completely separate groups of people invented farming independently in the same broad region at almost the same time? Nobody did assume that. For decades, the default position was a single origin model. Farming started somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, most likely the Levant, and the people who invented it carried their genes outward with their grain into Anatolia, into Europe, into Iran. One migration, one founding population, one genetic signature, gradually diluting as it spread. It made sense on paper. It made sense on a map. And for a long time, nobody had the tools to check whether it made sense in the DNA. So the model held, not because it had been rigorously tested, but because nothing had yet come along to break it. Researchers had radiocarbon dates. They had haplogroups. They had archaeological layers that seemed to line up neatly with the story everyone already believed. What they didn't have was the ability to read an entire genome and ask it directly, were these really the same people? That question wouldn't get answered for decades. And when it finally was, the answer didn't confirm what everyone expected. It didn't even come close. But to understand how strange that answer really was, you first have to understand exactly how solid the old evidence seemed, and why it took so long for anyone to notice it was pointing at the wrong story. The evidence backing the single origin model wasn't flimsy. Radiocarbon dates from Levantine sites like Jericho and Abu Huraira showed early domestication of wheat and barley by around 11,500 years ago. Further east, the Zagros foothills showed early goat management by around 10,200 years ago. Close enough in time, close enough in geography, that a single wave model seemed not just plausible, but almost inevitable. Two regions, a few hundred kilometers apart, both figuring out food production within a couple thousand years of each other. The simplest explanation was that it happened once and spread. Then there was the Y chromosome, haplogroup J, a paternal lineage passed down largely unchanged from father to son across thousands of years, showed up across both regions. In the Levant, in Mesopotamia, in Iran, the same broad genetic marker kept appearing. To researchers, working with the tools available at the time, that looked like confirmation, a shared paternal ancestry stretching across the entire Fertile Crescent, exactly what you'd expect if one population had expanded outward from a single point of origin. Everything fit, as long as you didn't look too closely. And for a long time, nobody had a reason to look closely. A Y chromosome haplogroup tells you about one lineage, a single paternal line stretching back through history. Mitochondrial DNA tells you about one maternal line. These are powerful tools. They can detect real signal across enormous stretches of time, but they are also narrow. Reading a single lineage and using it to describe an entire population is like reading one sentence out of a 1,000-page book and assuming you understand the whole plot. The broader genome, hundreds of thousands of variable positions spread across 23 pairs of chromosomes, remained almost entirely unread. Nobody had the technology or the ancient samples to check the story against the full picture, so the assumption stood until it didn't. That narrow lens mattered more than anyone realized, because the Middle East was never one story. It was at least two, running in parallel, separated by a wall of stone. The Zagros Mountains run for roughly 1,500 kilometers along Iran's western edge, with peaks exceeding 4,000 meters. East of the Zagros, the Iranian plateau opens into the Dasht-e Kavir and the Dasht-e Lut, two of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth. Together, these form a geographic barrier that most people underestimate when they look at a flat map and assume connection. From the Levantine coast to the Iranian interior, you don't cross open ground. You cross a fortress, mountains on one side, desert on the other, with only narrow, difficult corridors threading between them. This is the part the single origin model never accounted for. It treated the region as one continuous landscape, easy to move across, easy to unify under one migrating population. But geography doesn't work that way, and neither does human movement across it. A population trying to cross from the Levant into the Iranian interior wasn't taking a short walk through open country. It was attempting to cross one of the more serious natural barriers in the ancient world. Twice, mountains first, then desert. And it was exactly this fortress that preserved a separation far older than anyone expected. A split that had nothing to do with the last 10,000 years of farming and everything to do with tens of thousands of years before it. The genetic tools that could have revealed this earlier simply didn't exist yet. Y chromosome and mitochondrial studies could hint at complexity, but they couldn't map it. It would take whole ancient genomes, dug out of the ground itself, to finally show researchers what the mountains and the desert had been hiding all along. The crack in the old model appeared quietly in a university lab around 2016. Farnaz Braushaki and a team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from the remains of a Neolithic woman buried at Ganj Dareh, a site in the central Zagros mountains of Iran. The site dates to approximately 10,000 years before present, a period when the people living there were among the earliest goat herders on Earth. Braushaki's team sequenced her genome at 1.39 times coverage, enough to build a real portrait of her ancestry, enough to finally ask the question directly: was she part of the same founding population that had spread farming out of the Levant? When the researchers ran the analysis, they expected it to confirm the single origin model. Instead, it did the opposite. The Ganj Dareh woman belonged to a population that was neither ancestral to the first European farmers, nor had contributed substantially to the ancestry of modern Europeans. She wasn't a branch of the Levantine family tree. She wasn't a distant cousin of the population that had carried wheat and barley westward. She was from a different tree entirely. One that had been developing on its own path for a very long time before either group ever thought to plant a seed. This was the first hard genetic evidence that the two farming populations of the Fertile Crescent weren't the same people wearing different regional costumes. They were something closer to two separate lineages that happened to be developing food production strategies in the same broad geographic window, without being the same population at all. It was a small study, a single genome from a single burial site, but it was enough to put a crack in a model that had stood, largely unquestioned, for the better part of a century. And that crack was about to widen considerably, because Braushaki's team wasn't the only group asking these questions. The same year, Iosif Lazaridis and colleagues at Harvard published a landmark study in Nature. analyzing 44 ancient genomes from across the Near East, spanning roughly 12,000 to 1,400 years before the Common Era. This wasn't one burial site anymore. This was a wide net cast across the entire region, and the data it pulled back reshaped how researchers had to think about the whole area. When Lazaridis and his team plotted the ancient genomes using principal component analysis, a method that compresses enormous amounts of genetic information down into the clearest, most informative patterns, something became immediately obvious. The Neolithic populations from the Zagros and the Neolithic populations from the Levant did not cluster together. They sat in separate quadrants of the genetic map, distinct groups occupying distinct genetic space, not overlapping, not blending at the edges. Two farming populations, active in the same broad region during roughly the same window of time, showing up as genetically distinct from each other as either one was from the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe. That last part is what made researchers sit up. It wasn't just that Zagros and Levantine farmers were somewhat different. It was that the gap between them was comparable to the gap separating either group from populations thousands of miles away, populations they'd never had any contact with at all. That's not the genetic signature of neighbors who developed slightly different local traditions. That's the genetic signature of two populations that had been apart for an extraordinarily long time before either of them ever domesticated a single plant or animal. Ancient DNA had, once again, done what it kept doing throughout the past decade, overturning a model that had felt solid simply because nobody had the tools to test it properly. But the real shock wasn't just that these two populations were different. It was exactly how long they'd been different, and that number was still to come. Brauschaki's team calculated something that, once you sit with it, is hard to fully absorb. The Zagros Neolithic population and the Levantine Neolithic population had separated somewhere between 46,000 and 77,000 years ago. Not 4,000, not 7,000. Somewhere in the range of 50 to 70,000 years before the people at either site ever planted a crop or herded a goat. Let that sit for a moment. These weren't two farming communities who drifted apart over the centuries because one group settled in the mountains and the other settled in the lowlands. These were populations that had already been on separate paths since before the last ice age reached its peak, long before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, long before most of the migrations that shaped modern human genetics had even happened yet. The people farming goats in the Zagros and the people farming wheat in the Levant weren't distant cousins who'd taken different roads out of a shared homeland. They were closer to strangers who'd happened to end up practicing similar innovations, independently, in neighboring but separated territories, tens of thousands of years after their ancestors had already parted ways. This is the number that turns the story from interesting into genuinely strange. A divergence date measured in tens of thousands of years means the split predates nearly everything we associate with the rise of civilization in this region. It predates farming, it predates permanent settlements, it predates pottery. The wall between these two populations wasn't built by kingdoms or empires or religions. It was built by geography, by a mountain range and a desert, sometime deep in the Paleolithic, and it held for so long that it's still visible in the DNA of people living in the region today. Once you have a number like that, the next obvious question is whether it actually shows up in living people, or whether it's just an artifact of ancient bones. It shows up. It shows up clearly. Before I show you the last part, if you want to look at your own results and see where this Iranian-Arab split fits into your own bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Now imagine plotting this divergence onto living populations. You take DNA from modern Iranians, particularly Iranian Zoroastrians, who represent the least admixed descendants of the pre-Islamic population, and you run the same principal component analysis, Lazaridis used on the ancient genomes. Their genomes pull toward the ancient Zagros cluster. Not vaguely, not approximately. They sit in the same quadrant as the 10,000-year-old Ganj Dareh woman. The thread is direct, 100 centuries of ancestry still visible in the genome today. Then you plot modern Arab populations, particularly those from the Arabian Peninsula. Their genomes pull in the opposite direction, toward the Levantine Neolithic lineage, the same lineage that spread farming westward into Anatolia and eventually into Europe. Two populations, tested side by side, using the exact same method, landing in two entirely different corners of the genetic map, thousands of years after their ancestors split, and thousands more after that split had already been ancient history. This is the point where the old single origin model doesn't just weaken, it collapses. If Iranians and Arabs had descended from one founding population that spread out of the Levant and gradually differentiated, you'd expect their modern genomes to sit somewhere near each other, close cousins, with some regional drift between them. Instead, they land in the same positions as their respective dead ancestors from 10,000 years ago, on opposite sides of a divide that farming, empires, and religion never closed. Why DNA data makes this vivid at the individual level? In Yemen and parts of Saudi Arabia, haplogroup J1M267 reaches frequencies of 40 to 70%. This lineage is strongly associated with Levantine and Arabian paternal ancestry, tracing back to expansions that began in the Levant roughly 11,000 years ago. In Iran, that lineage drops dramatically. Instead, J2M172, a lineage concentrated in the Zagros and Caucasus arc, rises to 20 to 30%. Same broad region, same general time depth of expansion, but two completely different paternal signatures dominating in two neighboring populations. And the maternal side tells the same story independently. Mitochondrial haplogroups U7 and HV appear at elevated frequencies across Iran, but remain rare in Arab populations. This is worth pausing on, because why DNA and mitochondrial DNA trace completely separate inheritance paths? One follows fathers, one follows mothers, and they have nothing to do with each other mechanically. If the split between Iranians and Arabs were some kind of statistical fluke, or an artifact of how one particular study modeled ancestry, you would not expect two unrelated inheritance systems to independently point to the exact same boundary. But they do. Paternal lineage says the split is real. Maternal lineage says the split is real. And the whole genome data from Brauchaki and Lazaridis says the split is not only real, but tens of thousands of years old. Three separate lines of genetic evidence, gathered through three separate methods by different research teams, all converging on the same conclusion. This is the point where a finding stops being a curiosity in one paper and starts being something you have to take seriously as an actual feature of human population history in this region. And once you have that much agreement across independent evidence, the next question becomes almost mathematical. Could this pattern have emerged some other way, through ordinary drift and isolation, rather than a genuinely ancient and deep split? The data has an answer for that too. Here is what this pattern rules out. Random drift does not produce this signature. If Iranians and Arabs had shared a relatively recent common ancestor and simply diverged through isolation over a few thousand years, you would expect to see a gradient, a smooth genetic transition from one population's profile into the others, growing more different the further apart. Geographically, two groups happen to sit. That is what ordinary regional divergence looks like almost everywhere else on Earth. You do not see a gradient here. You see a boundary. Principal component analysis, which compresses the entire genome into its most informative axes of variation, consistently separates Iranian and Arab populations on the first two components, the strongest, clearest signals the method can produce. That means the single most significant source of genetic variation in the entire region isn't caused by latitude or longitude, or how close two population centers happen to sit on a modern map. It's caused by ancestry itself, by which of these two ancient founding populations a person's genome traces back to. Not modern borders, not trade routes, not which empire ruled a particular valley in a particular century. The ancestral split. Two independent inheritance systems, paternal and maternal, both draw the same line. Whole genome analysis draws the same line. Every method researchers have applied to this question keeps landing in the same place, which is exactly what you'd expect if the underlying cause is a genuinely ancient, deep divergence rather than a shallow, recent one, shaped by everyday geographic proximity. What this implies is significant. The Fertile Crescent was never one cradle of agriculture. It was two, operating independently, separated by mountains and desert, carrying genetic signatures that would persist through every empire, every conquest, every migration for the next 10,000 years. But even this isn't the complete modern picture, because something else arrived on the Iranian plateau later, something the Arab populations never received at all. Around 2,000 to 2,500 years before the Common Era, a new genetic signal appears in Iranian ancient DNA. Steppe ancestry, populations originating from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, carrying haplogroup R1a and a genetic profile associated with early Indo-European speaking groups, migrated southward onto the Iranian plateau. Today, roughly 16% of Iranian males carry R1a. In Arab populations, this haplogroup is almost entirely absent. This is the genetic signature of the Indo-Iranian migration, the movement that brought the ancestors of the Persians, the Medes, and other Iranian-speaking peoples onto the plateau, layering a completely new ancestral component on top of the much older Zagros Neolithic base. So modern Iranians aren't simply Zagros farmers who stayed in place for 10,000 years. They're a composite population, an ancient Zagros Neolithic foundation, overlaid with Bronze Age steppe pastoralist ancestry, with smaller contributions from Levantine and Caucasus populations mixed in over time. Modern Arabs, by contrast, carry that Levantine Neolithic base overlaid with varying degrees of African ancestry, particularly pronounced in the southern Arabian Peninsula, along with later Levantine and Mesopotamian admixture. And here's the part that's genuinely difficult to wrap your head around. These populations lived in neighboring regions for 10,000 years. Empires rose and fell across both territories: the Achaemenids, the Abbasids, the Mongols. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century carried Arabic language and religion deep into Iran. And yet, a 2024 study analyzing 50 ancient samples across 9 Iranian sites shows 3,000 years of genetic continuity on the northern Iranian plateau. From the Copper Age all the way through the Sassanid Empire, conquest changed language, it changed religion, it changed architecture and literature. It barely touched the genome at all. Which raises an obvious question. None of this fully settles whether that steppe contribution to Iran might actually run deeper than current models suggest, given how thin ancient sampling still is across the eastern half of the country. I went back and reread the Brauchaki paper a few times, because one detail kept nagging at me. The Ganj Dareh woman from the central Zagros shows her closest modern genetic affinity not to her geographic neighbors in Iraq or the Gulf states, but to Iranian Zoroastrians, Pakistanis, and Afghans. The people who resemble her most today aren't the ones living nearest her burial site. They're the ones who inherited her specific ancestral line, regardless of where modern borders eventually fell. That's the clearest way I can put what all of this actually means. Somewhere in the Zagros foothills 10,000 years ago, a woman herded goats, ground grain, and lived her life without ever knowing that the people farming wheat 300 kilometers to the west were as genetically distant from her as she was from the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe. Her DNA sat in the soil for 100 centuries, and when it finally spoke, It said something the textbooks had missed entirely, that the Middle East was never one family. It was two, living side by side, building civilizations in parallel, connected by trade, by empire, by religion, but never, not once in 70,000 years, fully merged. The history is on the map, but it's also in your code. To unlock it, check out the Origin DNA at the link below. It's a 3-volume PDF guide bundle that walks you through reading your raw data, mastering your matches, and tracing your deepest origins. Don't settle for surface-level test results. Click the link below and get your bundle.